Welcome to the current research on the impact of perfectionism and acceptance-based therapy on workers' mental health webinar. We're glad you're here today. My name is Tanya Hyde, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I'm the project manager with the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability, and this webinar has been made possible through the support of the Direct Access Program through the BC government. As I mentioned, my name is Tanya, and I'll be moderating the session and handling the Q&A portion. And our presenter today is Dr. Paul Flaxman. Dr. Flaxman is currently the Program Director of City University London's Master's Program in Organizational Psychology. Dr. Flaxman specializes in adapting cognitive behavioral therapy interventions to help improve employees' psychological health. Most notably, he has taken a prominent role alongside Professor Frank Bond in developing and evaluating acceptance and commitment therapy as a worksite training intervention. Dr. Flaxman was also involved in 2 separate research projects designed to promote and develop the health and safety executive management standards for work-related stress. I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Flaxman.
Thanks very much, Tonya. And thanks very much to the CIRPD for inviting me to be involved in this webinar. And thanks to everyone who's tuning in today. I'm sat here at home in the east of London. And during the webinar, I'm going to talk about some research and practice that we've been engaged in really over the last dozen years or so that looks at our research into perfectionism in the workplace and also touching upon acceptance and commitment therapy as a potentially useful workplace training program. I should just acknowledge the funders of our work. The Economic and Social Research Council have funded lots of our intervention and well-being research, and also Guy's and St Thomas's charity, who've funded our research connected to the UK's National Health Service. So an overview of the next 45 minutes or so, I hope, is first of all to share with you some of my learnings about the perfectionism literature, just to talk about the nature of perfectionism, how it's conceptualized and measured, and also touch upon a current and quite controversial debate that I've noticed in that literature. I'll then shift into discussing some of our work around work-related worry and rumination during leisure time, which has become an important strand of research within occupational health psychology. And then I'll take you through 3 studies that we've conducted, particularly diary studies that look at people's experiences during leisure time and how it impacts upon their work-related and personal well-being. And then towards the end, I'll touch upon these acceptance-based training programs that we offer in organizations, and just to discuss briefly some of the research connected to that. Now, to get everybody started, if you're willing, I'd like you to perform a small task for me. So I'm going to show 5 or 6 slides fairly slowly, and while I'm doing so, if you could grab a piece of paper and just jot down any aspects or effects of perfectionism that you would see as perhaps quite adaptive or useful, and also some outcomes or effects of perfectionism that you would see as more maladaptive or less helpful. So if you do have a piece of paper there, you could perhaps just draw a line down the piece of paper and have adaptive effects of perfectionism on the left and maladaptive on the right. So I'm going to flick through a few slides fairly slowly just to help you with this task, and just notice what shows up for you. Okay, now I always like to conduct this small task at the beginning of perfectionism sessions. One thing that I've found is that people find it relatively easy to come up with some adaptive as well as maladaptive effects of being a perfectionist. And in a way, this small task cuts right to the heart of current debate in the perfectionism literature, current controversy in the perfectionism literature, around whether we can distinguish a more healthy form of perfectionism from a more maladaptive or unhealthy form of perfectionism. What I'd like to do now is just show you the current academic conceptualizations and the two most prominent measures of perfectionism, just to give you a sense of how academics define perfectionism in the current research. First of all, we'll look at Randy Frost's measure. He developed the multi-dimensional perfectionism scale in 1990, which was an important period, the beginning really of the current era of research into perfectionism. Frost's scale has three very important subscales within it. First of all, concern over making mistakes, which is excessive concern about making mistakes and a fear of being criticized when we do make mistakes. So you can see on the slide there that I've included a couple of example items from Frost's measure. If I fail at work, I'm a failure as a person. If I fail partly, it's as bad as being a complete failure. So fear of failure and concern over making mistakes. Next is doubts about actions, which is the kind of inability to derive a sense of when a task is performed to your satisfaction. And what you find with people high in this characteristic is they tend to repeat tasks over and over again until it feels just right. So perfectionists, for example, can often check their emails very carefully over and over again for fear of making errors, spelling errors. And then personal standards, which we often see in most forms of perfectionism, is just having very high, perhaps excessive or unrealistic standards for performance. So setting very high standards for oneself, and if not doing so, feeling like you may end up a second-rate person. And it's these three subscales within Frost's measure that have received most research attention. I should just touch briefly on the other dimensions from this scale. First of all, there's two parental dimensions, which reflect the belief that one's parents set perfectionistic standards for oneself. And if we were unable to meet those standards, we would face punishment or criticism. The final subscale is organization. This is an interesting one because when we talk about perfectionism on a day-to-day basis, people often equate perfectionism to being highly organized. I've sometimes heard it described as a fetish for organization and neatness. But actually, this dimension of perfectionism doesn't correlate so well with the other dimensions and is often left out of perfectionism measurement models. The second major conceptualization and measurement of perfectionism was developed by Paul Hewitt, a clinical psychologist, and Gordon Flett, both based in Canada. They developed a perfectionism scale and called it the same thing, another multi-dimensional perfectionism scale. This measure has three dimensions of perfectionism. First of all, self-oriented perfectionism, which is the self-motivated drive to perceive perfectionism in one's behavior and performance. So you can see the items there. One of my goals is to be perfect in everything I do. And then socially prescribed perfectionism. This is the belief that others impose perfectionist standards on us. So it could be that we feel that our spouse or co-workers or parents impose perfectionist standards on us, and if we don't succeed in meeting those standards, we fear that we'll lose their approval. So there's a high fear of losing approval in socially prescribed perfectionism. And then there's a dimension that's received less attention, is other-oriented perfectionism. And in my earlier slides, I would say that Charlie Chaplin and Steve Jobs, in all likelihood, held this type of perfectionist belief where they expect others to achieve perfectionist standards. It's the first two that have received most attention, and these are the ones also that we study in our own research in the workplace. Now, one thing that's quite consistent in the literature that I find particularly interesting is that these various scales from the two main measures, they cluster into higher order perfectionism dimensions. So the doubts about actions dimension, the concern over mistakes from Frost's measure, and the socially prescribed perfectionism scale from Hewitt and Flett's measure, they cluster into higher order perfectionism dimension that's often called evaluative concerns perfectionism, because it reflects a deep concern with achieving perfectionist standards and of not being disapproved of by others. The personal standards dimension from Frost's measure and self-oriented perfectionism from Hewitt and Flett, they cluster together into another dimension, which is often called perfectionist strivings. And these two higher order dimensions in colour on the slide there, they are related, but they're also statistically distinct from each other. Evaluative concerns perfectionism tends to relate to neuroticism. Perfectionist strivings, however, doesn't tend to relate to neuroticism and actually is more likely to be related to conscientiousness. So on this slide here, you can see that the two main models of perfectionism actually are complementary, so they're often used together. And you can see this distinction between a more adaptive form of perfectionism and a maladaptive form of perfectionism. Now this next slide is my rather clumsy way of trying to summarize a whole body of research. Really to make the same point. So what I've done here is just summarize the sorts of things that these two higher order dimensions of perfectionism are related to. So you can see evaluative concerns perfectionism, which is the maladaptive side of the personality, tends to be related to less effective forms of coping, such as avoidant coping, lower levels of perceived social support, and higher levels of hassles and stress, and is also usually linked to negative emotions and psychological distress. In contrast, perfectionist strivings tends to be related to a range of positive characteristics, such as positive emotion, academic achievement among students, and more active forms of coping, more effective forms of coping. So again, just to summarize the same point, you're seeing this distinction between what can be described as a maladaptive form of perfectionism and an adaptive form of perfectionism. The reason why I find this interesting is it's a controversial debate in the perfectionism literature. I have a couple of quotes here that kind of exemplify this debate. So this is a quote from Gordon Flett and Paul Hewitt, who are more clinically oriented researchers. And they say that their research has an emphasis that's mainly clinical. So they focus primarily on the negative aspects of perfectionism. They go on to state that they remain unconvinced that what is being referred to as positive perfectionism is indeed positive and healthy. So what they're describing there as positive perfectionism is the perfectionist strivings that I was describing in my previous slides. But Stober and Otto, who conducted a very useful review of the perfectionism literature in 2006, which found that there was very strong evidence that certain types of perfectionism are related to a range of adaptive outcomes. So they posed the question, why is it that so many researchers find it difficult to accept that perfectionism can be positive? When I was preparing this presentation, I found a media article from a couple of years ago from here in the UK, a very sad story of one of the UK's top orthopedic surgeons. And it struck me because the article was really reflecting on this person's perfectionism. It was a guy who was found at home hanged after making a small mistake in an operation. And it seemed to me that the journalist had done her homework about perfectionism because all his friends and colleagues seemed to be describing him as a perfectionist, and particularly that he found it very difficult to make mistakes. And I think this rather sad story is perhaps one reason why more clinically oriented researchers are reluctant to see perfectionism as a potentially positive characteristic, because it's the clinical counselling researchers who will be dealing with these problems on a day-to-day basis. One thing that you're going to see in our data is when we look at perfectionism in the workplace, we do start to see this distinction between adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism. I just want to show you a couple of models that help to explain how perfectionism operates. Perhaps the most well-known theoretical model for explaining the effects of things like perfectionism and neuroticism is a diathesis stress explanation. So a diathesis is a fancy word for an underlying vulnerability, particularly a personality vulnerability factor. So this slide here shows that the underlying vulnerability factor can interact with particular types of life events. So a student who receives a B grade when they were expecting an A, someone who makes a mistake, even a minor mistake, perhaps some conflict with a colleague. It's this interaction between the underlying vulnerability of perfectionism that can lead to high distress. And the idea, actually, that perfectionism may just lie dormant until it is activated by particular life events. There's a more specific version of this hypothesis, which is called the specific vulnerability hypothesis, linked particularly to Hewitt and Flett's model. And it's the idea that self-oriented perfectionists tend to be more achievement-oriented, so that achievement-related stress is likely to trigger their vulnerability, resulting in psychological distress. In contrast, socially prescribed perfectionists are seen as more in need of approval from others, so a conflict with a colleague, for example, could be the stressful episode that triggers that vulnerability, leading to higher distress. And there is partial support for these hypotheses. So, for example, there has been some support found for the idea that self-oriented perfectionists are particularly hurt by achievement-related stress. There's less support for the specific vulnerability hypothesis for socially prescribed perfectionism, which appears to be a more generalized vulnerability. So lots of different types of stress can upset a socially prescribed perfectionist. The final way of looking at perfectionism is through reinforcement theory. The idea that maladaptive perfectionists tend to be motivated by negative reinforcement. So engaging in particular behaviors to escape from threat, to avoid bad things happening, a fear of failure, for example. Whereas adaptive perfectionism is more likely to be motivated by positive reinforcement. So engaging in perfectionist behaviors, high-level goals and standards to obtain rewards, to obtain favorable consequences. This is an interesting idea developed particularly by Slade and Owens in their dual process model of perfectionism, because they argue that the behaviors of these different types of perfectionists could be identical, but they're driven by different motivations. The maladaptive perfectionist driven by a fear of failure, whereas the adaptive perfectionist is more approach-oriented, looking for favorable outcomes and rewards. Now, I stumbled upon perfectionism almost by chance through another strand of my research that I'll mention in a moment. But when I did, I couldn't quite believe my luck, because there's a huge amount of perfectionism research being done on students and also research on clinical samples, but still very few studies looking at perfectionism in the workplace. In fact, there's probably about 10 or 12 well-designed studies still to this day. And I've sensed actually there's a very good rationale for beginning to focus more on perfectionism for employees' mental health. For example, when I look at the items from perfectionism questionnaires, I see that many of them already refer to work. And there's some interesting research looking at the domains of perfectionism, the idea that we can be perfectionist in different domains in our lives. And work often comes out as number one when adults are asked, where are they perfectionistic? Also, there's some research that shows that when we study perfectionism in older adult samples, the findings are sometimes different than the findings that we see in undergraduate student samples. And from my own point of view, I really feel that perfectionism is offering us something beyond the more traditional personality constructs, such as neuroticism, for understanding stress vulnerability in the workplace. Now, I said that I stumbled upon perfectionism, and this is kind of how it happened. I've been very interested for a few years in people's ability to detach and recover from work during their leisure time. And I was looking for individual difference variables that would help to explain the differences we see in people's ability to do this. Now, poor detachment from work in leisure time is seen as a problematic experience, because if we just continue thinking about work in our leisure time, it tends to be using, perhaps overusing, the same functional systems that we use at work. They can become depleted, leading to burnout. Also, during our leisure time, if we're lost in thoughts about work, we're not really very present. We're not able to contact sources of reinforcement in our leisure time, for example, sources of social support or mood repair. Taking this a little bit further, I'm interested in the most detrimental form of poor detachment from work during leisure time, technically called perseverative cognition, but in everyday language is worry and rumination. And Broshot defines this as the repeated or chronic activation of the cognitive representation of one or more psychological stressors. And it sits well with current theories about prolonged activation theories of stress. And the idea is that if we keep worrying and ruminating, we keep all those stress-related systems alive. So I've been developing a research program around these ideas. I developed a brief scale that asked people how much they worried and ruminated about work during leisure time. And you can just see some of the items on the screen in front of you. So during leisure time, for example, evenings, weekends, vacations, I asked people how much did they worry about how they deal with a work task or issue, or whether their thoughts kept returning to a stressful situation at work, a typical rumination item. One of my collaborators, Mark Cropley, who's also here in the UK, developed a similar scale around about the same time. He has different subscales: affective rumination, which is feeling quite annoyed or bothered by thinking about work during leisure time; a detachment from work scale, which is being able to let go from work, unwind after work; then a more adaptive problem-solving rumination, which is more constructive thinking about work, perhaps the type of thinking that leads to useful solutions. So I've been looking to bring all of these variables together: perfectionism, worry, rumination, and so on. And I had these questions in mind throughout all of the work that I'm going to present to you in the next few slides. So first of all, I wondered whether we could demonstrate that worry and rumination is particularly detrimental to employees' recovery during leisure time. And by extension, whether perfectionists show a particular vulnerability for continuing to worry and ruminate about work in their leisure time. And also whether we'd see this distinction between adaptive and maladaptive perfectionists in the way that they're thinking about work during leisure time. So I've got 3 studies to go through fairly briefly. The first study looked at the effects of perfectionism on employees' well-being around the Easter holiday in the UK. And this was a study I conducted with Julie Menard in Quebec, and Frank Bond and Gail Kinman here in the UK. It was published a couple of years ago now in Journal of Applied Psychology. I focused this study on academic staff because academia is very much an achievement-oriented profession. So I thought that certain types of perfectionism will perhaps be quite rife in this discipline, but also be interested to study within this profession. Because it was the Easter break in the academic calendar, I found that the academics involved took different lengths of respite during Easter. I should say academics are university professors, university lecturers. Some of these university academics took a weekend break during Easter. Some took a longer weekend, 3 to 4 days, because we had what's called a bank holiday here during Easter, and others took a longer vacation. So it allowed me to compare the effect of taking different amounts of time off work. And we gave these academics a perfectionism measure and asked them about their work demands and also assessed their demographic variables. And then we assessed their well-being around the Easter break. I'll show you the design in a moment. We focused particularly on this doubts about actions perfectionism from Frost's measure because this is seen as a quite compulsive form of perfectionism where people feel that they have to keep repeating tasks just to check that they haven't made any mistakes until they feel satisfied that they've done something perfectly. So it has obvious implications for work pressure and workload because if we're checking tasks over and over again, it's going to take us longer to complete those tasks. On this slide is an overview of the design that we use. So we'd already measured people's perfectionism, and in the week before Easter we measured their well-being and burnout levels. During Easter we measured again their well-being and burnout, and I asked them how they'd been thinking about work during Easter, if indeed they had been thinking about work. And then when they came back to work, we measured their well-being and burnout again for a couple more weeks. And here's some of the findings. So this first one is a measure of fatigue, academics fatigue, as a function of perfectionism. I hope you can see what's happening here. So along the bottom there you've got the weeks of the study, and it was week 2 that was during the Easter weekend. So the high perfectionist line is in blue, and the low perfectionist line is a dotted line in red. You can see that during the break, the perfectionists had a similar level of well-being to the non-perfectionists. Now this was quite a surprise. We weren't expecting this. We thought the perfectionists would have poor well-being throughout the study. But it shows that when perfectionists take a break from work, they really do benefit from that. So much so that their well-being was slightly better than the non-perfectionists. However, if you look at week 3, when these academics went back to work, you can see what happens. The perfectionist group immediately have an increase in fatigue, so they're back where they started, whereas the non-perfectionists have what we call a respite effect. So the effect of the Easter break was quite prolonged for them, carried on for a couple more weeks. One thing that we've argued in the paper is this is evidence of the diathesis stress model appearing before our very eyes, because during the break we've argued that the perfectionism vulnerability or diathesis was dormant, which is why their well-being was fine during the break. But when they went back to work they would have faced achievement-oriented stress, so their fatigue immediately increased. We saw a similar effect with burnout. This is exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. And you can see again, week 3, when these academics went back to work, the perfectionists only had an increase in exhaustion after the Easter break. And this is anxiety, fairly similar pattern occurring. We conducted what's called mediation analysis, which is trying to uncover the mechanisms of these effects. So why is it that these perfectionists experience this increase in fatigue and exhaustion when they went back to work? And one of the mechanisms we found was their tendency to worry and ruminate about work during the Easter holiday. So this experience of worrying and ruminating about work seemed to send the perfectionists back into work in a more depleted state than the non-perfectionists. At least that's what the statistical model was suggesting. What was interesting is we saw all these effects regardless of how long people took off work. So the length of the Easter respite had no effect on these results at all. Study 2, with my colleagues Sonia Carmichael, Chris Stride, who's our statistical modeler, and Mia Soderberg, who's a researcher in Sweden, were involved in this study. And here we were looking at people's evening leisure time, whether perfectionism affected people's evening leisure time, thinking about work and sleep quality. And we had a group of 160 government and healthcare employees. They were employees of our National Health Service. And again, we gave them a questionnaire where we measured perfectionism and neuroticism and various questions about work demands. And this was a daily survey study, so we asked these employees to complete surveys 11 times across a working week. And just briefly, here's the design. So we started on a Monday evening and we asked them how much they'd been thinking about work. As soon as they woke up the following morning, they had a booklet by their bed and they rated their sleep quality. And then as soon as they finished their work, we asked them to rate their levels of burnout and engagement at work that day. And again, during the evening, we asked them, how much have you been thinking about work? And we did this across the week. So it's known as a daily survey design. It gives us very interesting data. And much more accurate data we find than many other types of design. Now this is a rather horrendous and scary looking slide, but I'm showing this because our statistician has put this together, or built these statistical models. So let's have a look at evaluative concerns perfectionism first of all. What you can see is that across the week, the evaluative concerns perfectionists tended to worry and ruminate about work during their evenings. As a result of that, they had poorer sleep quality, higher levels of burnout, lower levels of feeling recovered in the morning, and lower levels of work engagement. In contrast, the perfectionist strivers, they thought about work, but they did it in a more constructive way during their evenings. And this was linked to high levels of work engagement during the week. And we found these effects after we'd controlled for things like job demands, how much control they had over work, demographics, and importantly, neuroticism as well. So again, you can see this distinction that I've been discussing between adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism. And our contribution here is not only showing that this appears in the workplace, but also by showing that these leisure time variables work as mechanisms. The way that perfectionists think about work in their leisure time appears to be important. Now I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to skip over this study because it's really along the same lines where we were looking at people's well-being across a working week, looking at the evening. Just a couple of findings I'll show you. One was that we saw that evaluative concerns perfectionism was particularly related to avoidant coping patterns in employees. And also, again, replicating what we found in a previous study, people ruminated about work during their evenings. And this was linked to high levels of negative emotion and stress. And we saw the distinction again. So even though evaluative concerns perfectionism was linked to avoidant coping, perfectionist strivings was negatively linked to avoidant coping. So an almost opposite pattern of results there, showing more effective coping patterns in the perfectionist strivers. So a few take-home messages for you after all that. I hope you've been able to bear with me through all those slides and results. But just to summarize at this point of the talk, it seems to us that it's particularly important that maladaptive perfectionists have a chance to take time off work and to detach themselves from work psychologically. We found that perfectionists do gain a lot of benefit from their leisure time. We also found very clearly across all these studies that worry and rumination during leisure time seems to be a very important stress variable. This is predicting employees' well-being above how much time people are taking off, how many hours they work at work and in their leisure time, and the degree to which they feel they're able to detach from work. After we control for all these variables, worry and rumination remains a strong predictor. So I think when we think about interventions, there's something here that we should be focusing on, which is how much employees worry and ruminate about work in leisure time. And replicating the findings from student studies, very clearly this evaluative concerns perfectionism dimension is reliably associated with less effective forms of coping. When we look at the perfectionist strivers, these are potentially more adaptive perfectionists. They are able to detach from work. They're less likely to use avoidant coping. And they do think about work as well, but what's interesting is they tend to think about work in a more constructive way, and it's linked to better outcomes like work engagement rather than burnout. So just moving into the final stage of today's webinar, I'd like to shift attention to the intervention implications of all of this. One thing that I notice in the perfectionism literature is there's a general feeling that core perfectionist beliefs themselves are actually quite difficult to change, and you will probably need fairly elaborate interventions, perhaps therapeutic interventions, to change these core beliefs. What's also important to know is that perfectionists are very reluctant to seek help. And often in therapy, perfectionism can get in the way of a strong therapeutic alliance. One reason for this is perfectionists don't like to show imperfection. So even being in therapy is a sign that they are not meeting their unrealistically high standards. However, I strongly feel that interventions, even if they're not trying to change perfectionist beliefs, can focus on what I call the products or processes of perfectionism. So this could be things like worry and coping skills, which of course we can train relatively easy in the workplace. Now, there are some good books. These are self-help books that have been written to help people with perfectionism. So if anyone tuning in today is prone to perfectionism, these are useful reads. Martin Anthony, for example, this self-help book has been evaluated in research studies, and Ross Chavran is a very respected psychologist here in the UK who writes a great deal about perfectionism, particularly clinical perfectionism. We've been more interested in more recent developments in the field of cognitive behavior therapy that I'm sure many listeners today are familiar with. So this is kind of like the mindful revolution, if you like, that's happened over the last 10 years or so. And we've become very interested in an acceptance-based therapy known as acceptance and commitment therapy. And we found that it's particularly suitable for workplace settings. Now, acceptance and commitment therapy is a mindfulness-based behavior therapy that's interested not in changing the content of people's difficult thoughts and feelings, but rather changing their behavioral function. So they don't necessarily reduce how much people are worrying about things, but reduces the impact of worry on people's behavior. It's often referred to as a trans-diagnostic intervention model because it cuts across different diagnoses, can be used with many different problems, and indeed is in groups and on an individual basis. What's different between ACT and other mindfulness-based approaches, such as mindfulness-based stress reduction, is ACT uses mindfulness but not as the main outcome. Mindfulness is used as a means to an end. And the ultimate goal of ACT is to help people use personal values as a guide to action, to generate more meaning and purpose in their lives. If you read any books about acceptance and commitment therapy, you'll find this model in there. This is the intervention model. It has 6 processes that all cultivate a particular construct called psychological flexibility. And the interventions are all focused on cultivating these 6 processes. I can actually summarize these processes, though, into 3 higher order practices. So ACT is designed to help people become more open, more willing to experience difficult thoughts and emotions, more aware, more able to contact their present moment experience, and that's where mindfulness comes into ACT. And also more active, particularly taking action based upon and guided by their personal values. So in ACT you find a lot of values work, putting people in touch, helping them to clarify their personal values, most important values. So it's a really useful intervention model we found, and we can easily translate it into skills-based programs and offer it as resilience training in the workplace, and that's exactly what we've been doing for the past 10 years or so. This construct of psychological flexibility lies at the heart of ACT. This is a technical definition of it. The ability to contact the present moment and all the thoughts and feelings the present moment contains without needless defense, and based on whatever the particular situation affords, to persist or change behavior in the service of chosen values. It's a rather technical definition of ACT, psychological flexibility. There's a cartoon here. I hope this has come out okay on your slides, but this cartoon I think describes ACT better than all the words that I'm using. You can see that this guy here is stepping in a value guided by his values. And on the balloons you can see that he's holding some of the less pleasant psychological content that we humans experience, like self-doubt, anxiety, uncertainty, and ugly memories. What's important from an ACT perspective is he's holding those balloons lightly. He's experiencing those things and he's stepping in a value direction. So ACT contains psychological and behavioral skills that helps people to disentangle themselves a little bit from these negative experiences that can interfere with our behavior, just so that they're better able to take action on their values. And ACT sees values-based action as particularly important because it tends to give people a sense of meaning, purpose and direction in their lives. And the important thing in ACT is there's no need to try and get rid of self-doubt or dampen anxiety to do this. The skills are based around the idea of making room for this stuff and taking valued action. So I like to see it as quite an empowering intervention approach, and that seems to be people's experience. There's several randomized control trials now of an ACT in the workplace conducted by my own research collaborators and others around the world, in the US, particularly in Sweden. We found in our research that a majority of distressed employees who go through this type of training, just 3 half-day sessions of training, experience clinically significant improvements. So this is going beyond just statistically significant improvements and producing benefits as good as one-to-one therapy, even though it's a workplace training program delivered over 3 half-day sessions and is presented as a workplace training program. It's not presented as therapy in the way that we do it. And again, our research has repeatedly demonstrated that it's this psychological flexibility construct that is the mechanism. So we're not really changing the content of people's thoughts and feelings, we're changing the function of their thoughts and feelings. If you like, we're reducing the impact of difficult thoughts and feelings on people's behavior. And some of the research that we've seen is that actually psychological flexibility is the mechanism of ACT rather than decreasing people's perfectionist beliefs. And we compared ACT with CBT in a paper that was published in Behavior Research and Therapy. And we found that it was only ACT that was working through psychological flexibility. We didn't find a clear mechanism for our CBT intervention in the workplace. So I think I'm showing that slide just to emphasize that ACT seems to work for different reasons than more traditional CBT approaches. If you excuse the shameless plug, if anyone's interested in this training program, we've actually written it up now as a manual, which is published as a book called The Mindful and Effective Employee. So you'll see a blow-by-blow account of how we deliver these interventions in that book. So I'm wrapping up now. This is my final slide, final reflections. One thing that I've discovered is that perfectionism looks like a very viable and valuable research area for those interested in promoting mental health in the workplace. And my sense is it's been neglected by workplace researchers. So part of my motivation is to conduct more research on employee perfectionism rather than just student perfectionism. Again, I don't think I can make this point strong enough, really. You've seen it in my research and what I've been saying. I really feel this worrying and ruminating in leisure time is a variable that we should be going after because it's strongly linked to poor recovery, to burnout, and poorer mental health in employees. And these recent developments in CBT, ACT and mindfulness, I think have great potential for improving employees' mental health, particularly when we translate them into fairly simple training programs and roll them out into organizations. So I think that's enough from me. Just wanted to say thanks very much for tuning in today and listening to our research.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Flaxman. That was a very good presentation. We do have a question. I would invite people to go ahead and submit questions if you have any for Dr. Flaxman right now. We have one from Shannon, and she asks if there's research on perfectionism and chronic pain in regards to return to work. A little bit more specific, she works with the population of people with chronic pain with a focus on return to work post-injury, and finds that type A personality types tend to have a greater difficulty adapting to changes in their level of functioning and developing more adaptive coping skills.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know. It would certainly be worth a look. I wouldn't be surprised because the perfectionism literature is huge. I was interested in the comment about type A. One thing that we do see with perfectionists is the maladaptive perfectionists tend to be avoidant copers. And we know that avoidant coping around pain is, I think, as I understand it, not the most effective strategy, and actually these acceptance approaches can be more useful for pain management. So I would imagine that if the perfectionists are seen as avoidant individuals, it will have implications for pain management. But I'm not aware of any specific research, I'm afraid.
Okay, very good. And that seems to be all of our questions at this moment. We can give just a moment to see if anyone else has any further questions.
Okay.
Oh, let's see. There was a question from Monica asking, does age change or accentuate the type of coping mechanisms that people use in regards to perfectionism?
Oh, that is a good question. There are some slight differences in the older adult samples compared to the younger adult samples. One paper I've got in mind when I say that is another study of university academics actually conducted in Canada, and they found that the type of perfectionism that's usually seen as adaptive in the student literature was found to be maladaptive among Canadian university researchers. And I know that those that research team were talking about the age implications of perfectionism. And I think there is an argument that over time we do tend to get better at knowing which coping strategies are going to work in different situations.
Very good. And there was a question wondering, and I can't remember if I asked you in advance, if people can get a copy of the PowerPoint. Do you mind if we post a PDF of the PowerPoint for people to access?
Not at all, no, please.
Great.
I'd be honored to have my slides circulated, yeah.
Wonderful, then I will do that after the event, so the PowerPoint will be available for people. Any further questions that people want to submit? I'll just give it just a second.
Sure.
While we're waiting for that, I will go ahead and let people know that we do have our next webinar on May 13th with Dr. Howard Hamer on recognizing and treating early chronic pain disorder in the injured worker. So I'll send out some registration information on that shortly here. And I think that's all the questions we have. So thank you very much, Dr. Flaxman, for the presentation. I've gotten a couple of positive responses saying that it was a really good presentation that they found very eye-opening and informative. Oh, actually, you know, I do have one more question. Someone asking what the research is about perfectionism and procrastination.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big research area. Again, I think if the person Googles perfectionism, procrastination, again, most of it's done in students, but there's a very strong link between maladaptive perfectionism and procrastination. And it's really because maladaptive perfectionists get a sense that their high standards are going to make most tasks extremely stressful and difficult, particularly if they're important tasks. So putting it off, avoiding it, is easy to do for these perfectionists. So yeah, you'll find lots of research around perfectionism and procrastination.
Very good. Okay, then I think that's everything. Thank you very much, Dr. Flaxman, and thank you everyone for attending today.